Hey guys, in this lesson, I want to tackle this idea of state and introduce you to React hooks as a way of being able to make our website interactive and actually have changeable state. Go ahead and fork the starting project for this lesson. And once you're done, have a look at what we've got here. Now, unlike our previous React apps, I've actually got all of my React code currently living inside my index.js. And there's a reason for this that you're going to discover very soon. But inside our index.js, the code is very simple. All that we're doing is rendering a single div that has an h1 and a button contained inside it. The idea is simple. How can we get this button to trigger an update in this number, so that every time the user presses on this plus button, this number actually goes up in value? So let's think about how we might approach this. Well, firstly, this h1 has a hard-coded value in it, so that's not going to work. So let's go ahead and create a new variable called count, and let's set it to equal to 0. And then we'll replace this hard-coded value with this variable count. Nothing has changed so far in the user interface. Now, the next thing we need to do is to be able to trigger some piece of code to happen whenever this button is clicked. So we know from our HTML that all of our button elements have an attribute called onClick, and we can set that to equal some sort of function to be triggered when this button receives a click action. Now we know that when we're creating React components, that all of these HTML elements and their attributes gets converted into camel case. So something like this. So we can, in fact, set this onClick attribute to a function in our code. So let me create a function called increase, and all that I'm going to put inside is just a simple log statement saying I got clicked. And now in our onClick, I'm going to add a set of curly braces and assign it that function. Now what should happen is when I click this plus button, then it should call this function increase and it should log this message. And indeed it does. If you look inside the console, I get a new message being logged every time I press this button. So our code is working. But how can we increase the count that's being shown here? Well, one way you might think of doing this is to simply just write count plus plus, and this should increase the value of count every time the function increase is called. And indeed it does. Let's go ahead and log the value of count inside the increase function, and then I'm going to click on the plus button. And you can see that in the console, which is logging the value of count, it is indeed increasing by 1 each time I press the button. But our user interface is not changing at all. Nothing is happening. It looks dead to me. So what's going on here? Well, remember that even though we're writing HTML elements, they're not actually real elements, right? We're relying on the React DOM to actually render each of these elements onto the screen. So if we wanted to update what's on screen, we actually have to re-render all of this. So if we wanted this to update, one way of doing this instead of console logging would be to call React DOM.render all over again inside our function. Now, if I hit save and I click the plus button, you can see that it does indeed work. And every time I press this button, effectively what it's doing is re-rendering everything that's on screen, which is our div and our h1 and our button. And this is kind of inefficient, right? And besides, the code also looks terrible. We have all of this repetition that's not really doing anything for us. So how do people actually solve this problem using React? Well, this is where hooks come in. And there's a hook called useState that is perfect for this situation. But one of the rules for using hooks is that you must use a hook inside a functional component. So we have to create a function that renders a component, and then inside that function we can use hooks. So let's go ahead and import our app.jsx. and move all of our code into our app.js. And then back in our index.js, all we need is our React DOM.render, and then we're just rendering a simple app component. So now we can focus on our app component. And I'm going to just start off by wrapping everything inside a function, which is called app, so that this gets rendered. And instead of using React DOM.render and all of this document, get element, etc., all I'm going to do is just use the return statement so that this becomes the output of our app component and it gets created on screen, which you can see right here. Now I'm going to delete all of this repeated React DOM code, and you should be left with something that looks like this. Now, inside our app component, instead of using this count, I'm going to create a new constant that I'm going to call state. And I'm going to set this state to react.useState, which is a function. Now, this useState function comes from the React module. So I can either call it like this, or as you've seen from the import and export lesson, we can also just add a comma and then a set of curly braces and import that useState function as a non-default export. So now instead of saying react.useState, I can simply just write useState whenever I need it. Now, what is this useState exactly anyways? So I'm going to go ahead and comment out my count, and also I'm going to delete the count that currently lives inside my h1 so that I get rid of my errors. And instead, I'm just going to log what this state is actually equal to. Notice how state holds the return value of this function useState. And if I log it, you can see it's comprised of an array with 2 items. The first item seems to be undefined, and the second item is some sort of function. If I go ahead and add a value in here, let's say 0, and again my console log gets triggered, you can see the first value of my array gets replaced with whatever it is that I put in here. What's inside these parentheses is basically our starting state. And if we wanted to get hold of this value through this state, we can simply say state and square brackets 0. So that gets hold of the initial value that we put into this function. And of course, now we can then use this state inside our React component. So I'm going to replace that hard-coded 0 once more, but this time I'm going to tap into this new array called state and get hold of the first value. And you can see it's now being displayed on screen. And whenever I change my state, you'll see it update automatically in our h1. So effectively, we're telling this h1 to track the value of our state. And whenever the state updates, then it should also re-render this h1. This way, it's way more efficient than us calling React DOM.render, and it only updates the parts that need to be changed, such as this h1. Now, because the output of useState is an array, we're forced to write code like this. If we want to get hold of the first item out of that array, we're using this square bracket notation, which is very ugly because it has no meaning. At some point down the line, we're going to forget what state 0 is, and it's going to be hard to debug other issues when they come up. Now, in JavaScript ES6, there's this concept called destructuring. And what it allows you to do is to destructure a complex structure. So the complex things in JavaScript are objects and arrays. Let's say that I had a constant which was a RGB color, right? And it was an array comprised of 3 values. If we head over to flatUIcolors.com, which is a really nice color palette where you can simply just copy these color values. Let's change the color to the RGB format, so red, green, blue, and let's just copy this electron blue color. Now, if I go ahead and paste this here, you can see that this color is comprised of 3 elements. the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue. Let me go ahead and add this inside my array. If I wanted to access the amount of red or green or blue, I would have to log something like RGB at index 0 for the amount of red, or 1 for the amount of green, etc. And this is really bad code because it doesn't mean anything at all. And if this code was separated from where the RGB array was declared, and you just saw this out of the blue, I mean, what does that even mean, right? What can we do instead? Well, we can destructure this array so that instead of having this name, RGB, we can use a set of square brackets. Remember that we're working with an array, and arrays are declared using square brackets, so we also deconstruct them using a square bracket. And then we can provide some names for each of the elements inside the array, ordered by their positions. So I could call the item at index 1 red, the next one green, and the last one blue. And what's going to happen behind the scenes is this variable name red is going to be mapped to this first value, green is going to be mapped to the second value, and blue is going to be mapped to the third value. So now if I simply just log the value of blue, you can see that the third value gets outputted. So given that we know that this useState function outputs an array with a value and a function, then we can give each of these a name instead of just calling it state. So let's open up a set of square brackets, and given that we're going to be using this state to hold the value of our counter, I'm going to give the first item of the array a name, which is called count. So now, whenever I want to access the value that's stored inside the state, all I have to do, instead of saying state at position 0, I can simply just tap into count, and it does the same thing. It gets hold of the output of this function, which is an array with 2 items, and because we've only got one name specified in our destructuring, it assigns this name to the first value, which is the initial value. So how do we use this useState hook to update its value? Because, yeah, it's great that we can change the initial value, but how can we change it later on? For example, when we want to call increase. What's the equivalent of the count plus plus? Well, remember that we mentioned that this array that gets returned from this function has 2 items. The first one is a value, and the second one is a function. Well, we can give that function a name. Let's call it setCount, because that's basically what it's going to do. This is going to be the function that's going to be used to update this value inside our state. Inside the increase function, I'm going to call setCount, and I'm going to pass it a new value. So let's say maybe 12. So now let's track what's going to happen. First, when my app loads up, I call useState, and I give it an initial value. This value gets stored inside this variable count, and it gets rendered inside our h1. Now, when the user presses on this button and the on-click gets triggered, the increase function is activated. And this increase function is going to call setCount, which is going to update the state of my count variable. And I'm setting it to equal 12. Let's go ahead and take a look in our website. When we refresh, it starts out with this initial value for the count. And then when I press the plus button, it gets set to whatever it is that I set it to inside the increase function. But notice how if I keep pressing this, nothing happens. It's just going to keep resetting it to 12, which is not very useful for a counter app. What can we do instead? Well, let's set this count to 0 to begin with, make it more like a counter, and then I'm going to set my count to the current value of count plus 1. So count plus 1. And now when I press this button, you'll see that it just increases by 1 each time. As a challenge, go ahead and create another button down here. And instead of increasing the value, you want it to decrease the value. So it should have a minus sign inside. And when you click on it, it should go the opposite way. Pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so we've got an increase function that's tied to the plus button, but we should probably also have a decrease function that's tied to the minus button. Now, when this button gets clicked, we trigger the decrease function, and inside here, we are again going to call setCount, which is the function that's going to allow us to update the value of count. And we're going to say count -1. So now if we update our website and we press the plus, it goes up. We press the minus, it goes down. And this is all achieved using the useState hook. To recap, in this lesson, we're introducing this concept of state in order to have interactivity in our app. And what we're trying to achieve is for our website to be able to update dynamically, reflecting the updated state. Now, the state comes from this useState hook, and this function comes from the React module. Now, when we first call this function, we get to define an initial value, and then we get to use this value inside our destructured array, which we called count. So we're putting that value of count inside our h1, and then we get to trigger the setCount, which is the function that's going to update the value of count. And we do that when the user clicks on our plus button. And we set it to the current value of count +1. So it increases it by 1 each time. Now, the idea of hooks might be quite unfamiliar to you, but once you wrap your head around its mechanism, it's incredibly powerful and really useful when you want to create any sort of interactive app. Now, don't worry if you're still trying to get to grips with this concept, because it's something that is quite foreign. And I recommend as a first step to simply delete all of the code that you have in your code sandbox right now, and then to recreate this app from scratch yourself. So delete everything that's inside app.js and refresh yourself just simply on the syntax to begin with, because it looks pretty weird. And in the next lesson, I've got another challenge for you to implement this useState hook. So you're going to be getting plenty of practice, and we're also going to be talking about destructuring a little bit later on as well. For now, what I want you to do is just to get familiar with the syntax, be able to write this code from scratch yourself without looking at the video, and be able to understand how we actually got here in the first place. So pause the video now, have a play around with the sandbox, and I'll see you on the next lesson for a challenge.